Let's begin. Korea Global Forum for Session. This session will be sponsored by KINU. I would like to make a housekeeping announcement for the participants here physically in the room. Be sure to put on your mask at all time throughout the conference, and also for the smooth moderation of the event, be sure to turn off your mobile phones or change them to vibrant mode. This session will deal with the topic of North Korea's socio-economic changes in the Kim Jong Un era population, employment, women. Since Kim Jong came into power in 2012, there have been a lot of changes at home and abroad in the DPRK. We'll especially take a look at the dimensions around population, employment, and women in order to take a deeper look into the changes occurring within the society. We have online participants as well. You can go to the link provided to you, and you can leave your questions in the comment section, which will be relayed to the moderator for the session. There will be 6 panelists for the session. Dr. Ingrid Mitte will be connecting from Germany. Now, the moderator, Mr. Kim Byung-ro, professor of the Unification Peace Research Institute at Seoul National University.
Good afternoon. I've just been introduced. My name is Kim Byung-ro of Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. I will be moderating this session hosted by KINU. And I've just been introduced. We are living in the 9th year since Kim Jong Un came to power. When it comes to the nuclear power issue and Kim Jong Un's governance style, I know that many people are very interested in those issues, but beyond that, there have been some massive changes within North Korea. So today we want to have some discussions regarding a domestic situation in the DPRK. Ever since the arduous march, there were many people who died in the DPRK. There are much loss and suffering. There were a lot of changes within DPRK, and Chairman Kim announced a new change towards economic revitalization, and this led to many changes with the economic policies fostered by the DPRK regime. This has also led to adjustments in the industrial structure and also many changes regarding the education of the DPRK. And so we should all learn more about the changes in the employment structure in the DPRK. And within the DPRK, as participants and actors, there must be many different ideas that people have when it comes to women, gender, the idea of family. So we should all learn more about those changes within the family structure of the DPRK, those small but very significant changes within North Korean society. So we will discuss those today. We have 120 minutes or 2 hours that's going to be streamed live. Let me just briefly introduce our speakers and discussants to you today. To my left, as you can see, they're sitting here in order. We do have 3 presenters, 2 discussants, and we also have 1 international discussant who will be joining us from Germany. Dr. Hong Jae-hwan, I would like to introduce him first. Dr. Hong Jae-hwan received as a PhD in economics at SNU. Currently is a research fellow at the KINU, at the Korean Institute for National Unification. Looks at DPRK economy primarily. And his recent research topics include how the governance structure of North Korean companies, development cooperation, measures for the DPRK companies. So today we would like to hear more about the demographic changes within DPRK society. Next, we'd like to hear from Dr. Choi Ji-young. Yes, Dr. Choi is also with KINU. He's a research fellow at the same institute, received her doctorate at Korea University, was also a deputy economic researcher at the Bank of Korea. Her research interests also include the DPRK economy, looking specifically into the industrial structure, demographics, and non-formal or non-formal, unofficial economy. Last year, she wrote about the openness and reform of a DPRK economy and the profit structure coming out of its trade in the DPRK, which is a little bit of a challenging issue. Our third presenter is Lee Hee-young, professor at Daegu University. Professor Lee studied at Berlin University, received doctorates in sociology, and also studied at Kazel University, received a doctorate in sociology, and has been working at Daegu University since 2007. She is also very active socially, working at the Magdalena Institute, a community, and also the president of Critical Society. She studies migrant women, and minorities. We also have three discussants with us today. First, the offline presence is here. Kim Kyu-chul, Kim Soo-jung, followed by Ingrid Mite, who's joining us online. Kim Kyu-chul, would you like to say hello? Kim Kyu-chul is working at the KDI, the Korea Development Institute, as an associate fellow. Received his degrees at SNU, also a degree at Pennsylvania State. Has been working at KDI since 2017. Kim Kyu-chul also looks at the wider DPRK economy. His very interesting research interests include, for example, in 2017, anthracite coal prices in North Korea, for example. And last year's research includes North Korea, how far away is it from being a normal economic regime? Very interesting research topics that he has looked into. Kim Soo-jung is our second discussant joining us offline. Kim Soo-jung received her degree at Korea University on Development Economics, was a BK21 scholar at Korea University, and she joined KIET last July, an associate fellow at KIET. Her research interests include DPRK economy and industrial structure in particular, and the sustainable development of DPRK. Lastly, joining us from Germany is Professor Ingrid Mite. Can we see her on screen, please? Yes, we see her now. Hello, will you say hello to our audience? That's Professor Ingrid Mite. She is currently at the Justus Liebig University Gießen in Germany. Received a doctorate in political science. Greifswald-Watt University. She was a research fellow there. And also at Darmstadt. She was also a professor there as well. And beginning in 2010, she has joined the staff at Gießen University. Currently, she's in sociology at the sociology department at Gießen University. She looks at education. In fact, one of her publications is very popular, The Idea of Education and Socialization, globalization, talking about knowledge transfer between different states. So globalization and the idea of education. In the interest of time, we have three presenters, three discussants. So if we take into account that we have 120 minutes, we will give about 20 minutes to each of the presenters. So they will each have 20 minutes. And the discussant should keep their remarks to within 10 minutes. And then after we hear what the discussants have to say, the speakers will respond to that for about 5 minutes or so. So first, we'd like to move to Dr. Hong Jae-won for the first presentation. We'll be talking about international comparison, the demographic specificities, and the causes of DPRK.
예,
Good afternoon. I'm from the Korea Institute for National Unification. I'm Hong Jae-hwan. I will talk about demographic transition and socioeconomic changes of North Korea, especially not really changes after the Kim Jong Un era, but we're trying to take a look at the long-term, the demographic changes that have occurred in North Korea. Table of contents here. I will first raise the issue as to why I decided to conduct this research, and there will be an analysis on North Korea's demographic transition and its socioeconomic factors. Demographic structures can be determined and can be affected by policies as well as socioeconomic factors. And especially, I will take a look at socioeconomic factors that had an impact on demographic transition of North Korea. And I'll talk about demographic dividend or demographic dividends or bonus and economic growth of North Korea. There is a very strong relations between demographic changes and economic growth and what changes the country has gone through so far. In terms of the issue at hand, we are looking at these countries in comparison to North Korea by income level. We don't have advanced economies here. We have middle income countries and low income countries here. Now, red line shows where North Korea is at, and other countries are represented in different colors according to their income level. What's really noticeable about this graph is that in terms of the income level, North Korea should be classified as a low-income country, which belongs to the blue line here. So it should be close to those countries along the line of blue in terms of premature birth and mortality rate. But if as you can see from the graph here, North Korea is showing a very rapidly declining birth rate as well as the mortality rate, although it is not categorized as a low-income group. Well, it is actually showing the level that is similar to that of mid and high-income group countries. We say that there is a very strong relations between the premature birth and mortality rate to income level. But it is showing similarities to those countries in the mid and high income group brackets in terms of premature birth and mortality rate. And this is literature from the World Bank. Here the slide shows, please take a look at the right part of the slide. That's where demographic changes are taking place at a very slow rate. So they're just going through the initial phase of demographic changes, and we see these countries that have already gone through demographic changes, starting from the left to right. This LIC, which stands for low-income countries, they're mostly countries with very limited demographic changes, but the yellow ones, high-income countries that have already gone through such structural changes in population. So income level and demographic transition are closely related with each other. What's interesting to note from here is that once you have that full-fledged development in demographic transition, now you have this one country that is still low income, which is North Korea. It's marked here as a red dot here. So even from the previous slide as well as from this slide, why is North Korea at that level in terms of income level and demographic transition? So why are they not really closely related to the income level versus the demographic transition? We say that there's a puzzle in terms of income level and demographic transition. Why is North Korea not really included as part of these groupings? And especially when you had a population change, there's that point in time that really has a positive impact on economic growth. And North Korea has already gone through that phase, yet it's still not maintaining a very highly advanced economy. So that's where I want to focus my presentation on in my next slides. So North Korea has gone through a lot of changes in terms of population against the income growth. So what are some of the general discussions on demographic transition factors? First, you have a low mortality rate, and in certain point in time, then the birth rate actually comes down. That's a typical phase that any one country would go through. So what are the factors that would drive down mortality rate and also the birth rate or fertility rate? We had some advanced studies here, and the literature shows what we know already. So the biggest determining factor for mortality rate is healthcare. It is very important to have low child death rate, and then you have more income, you have more education, and then you have enhanced education and family planning, market opportunities. So all these developments have to take place at the same time, which would have a positive impact in terms of mortality rate. And this is something that we were able to demonstrate from previous research. In terms of a fall in fertility rate, especially we see that the death rate comes down first, and then you see fertility coming down. And then you see income level going up, and you see education level going up, especially amongst women. That's very important that women are very highly educated. Then the fertility rate starts to come down. And as for family planning, we cannot really say that there's any broad consensus on this. People say that family planning could be effective in part in terms of reducing fertility rate. So I put a question mark next to that because opinion is still divided on that. So there are all these factors that are affecting the demographic transition of any society. So taking all of these factors into consideration, how do we explain North Korea? It's a low-income country, but still it was able to see such rapid demographic transition. So there are three social economic factors that I want to bring your attention to. First is income level. Here the graph shows that from the 1960s to 2010, every 10 year, I broke it down by 10-year decade. I put the world average income level and the medium income level and North Korea's income level. So you can see these three different figures: world level, median level, and North Korea. So in the 1960s, the blue spots over here with the figures, there are 146 countries that were surveyed as part of my research. And it shows the ranking of North Korea versus this 146 countries. It was 90 in the 60s and was 100 in the 90s. And it is now 128th in terms of income level. So the ranking has aggravated over the years. And North Korea's income level, even compared to median level, is showing a wider gap. So the economic situation is actually getting worse in North Korea. So in the 60s and 70s, where North Korea went through a lot of population changes, North Korea was not a low-income country like it is right now. It wasn't that poor. I think that is probably the reason why we had the population change back then in the 1960s and 70s. So it had this early development in terms of population because its income level was quite high. So again, there's that relations between income and population because the income level was not that bad. So country was able to have this population change. But with the income level coming down as years pass by, which is a very peculiar case that is only existent in North Korea, hence it had that population change. And as a result, so because North Korea used to enjoy a high level of income, we could say that the population shift really occurred in early stage. But pictures here show that those factors are not enough to explain the situation because here you have NK and SK. That's South Korea and North Korea. NK represents North Korea. SK is South Korea. So whether it is NK or NK or South Korea, it shows the relations between income and death and birth rate. It is at the bottom of the distribution, shows versus the income level. The child death rate was very low. And the red dots on the right side shows the relations between per capita income level and total fertility rate. Now you see NK and SK in the middle of that distribution chart. That's South Korea and North Korea. Here, compared to its income level, South and North Korea have very low total fertility rate. What does that mean? So in the 1970s, its income level was relatively high for North Korea compared to the level now. Even so, its fertility rate and the death rate back then were already very low, even considering the income level. So there was a very fast population shift, which means that there are other factors at play that would affect the population change. The second factor is that there would be a relations to the socialist regime of the country. As you understand, there's a free medical care system and free education system. It's just nominal, it's tokenism, and there's really not any substantial free services available for the citizens. But how was it in the past? True that the system was working and it was functional, so there was free education for people and free medical care. So that's a factor to be considered as well. As for free education, in 1956, that education system was introduced for the first time. For the primary education in 58, there was free secondary education that became mandatory. And even back then, the admission rate for school was very high. 65% in 1946 and 98% in 1949. And right after the Korean War in 1953, the admission rate, attendance rate for school was 82%. So children were educated. It's 1965. This is the women's primary school attendance rate. And we see the total fertility rate in 1980, the relations between the two. In 1965. So this is a primary school attendance rate in 1965 because the people that would graduate from school and then marry and then have children, they would be having children around 1980. So if the attendance rate was high, then you would have lower total fertility rate in the 1980s. So we saw the relations between the two across two different periods. Now we had a very high primary school attendance rate for women back then, which would lead to the lowering of total fertility rate in later years. Second factor I want to focus on is free medical care. In the 1960s and 70s, those systems were working okay. If that is true, then even compared to the income level of North Koreans, the benefits that citizens would have gotten from the government in terms of medical care would be great. Because the country is a socialist regime and they were able to introduce the systems early on. So compared to the income level, there was an early development of population change. The third factor is a historical view. As we saw from the comparison between NK and SK South and North Korea, in 1970, not only North but also in South Korea, the birth rate was quite low even compared to the income level. And why was it so? One factor is that it's because of the common historical background of the South and North. Is that the modern medical technology? For example, compared to other underdeveloped economies, was introduced to the country early on. Towards the end of the Joseon dynasty, if you look at various research on population change, then there's a lot of research pointing to the fact that the fertility rate was coming down with more technologies coming in from abroad. So with that, you would have less death rate, and then you would have then the ripple effects, knock-on effect on the fertility rate. For the low income and mid-income countries, we didn't have a lot of data to work on, but mostly in the 1930s and 40s, their death rate, mortality rate began to come down, began to decline, which means that even before this revolutionary changes occurred in society, we saw changes taking place in terms of population. So let's put all of these into perspective. First of all, we had an early introduction of modern technology that would lead to low death rate. And up until 1960s and 70s, the North Korean economy was not that bad, was not in bad shape. Because it's a socialist country, education and healthcare were provided free of charge, and the quality was quite high. And I think these factors are able to explain why there was that mismatch between the income level and demographic transition. And I won't be able to go into these other slides in the interest of time. Another point that I want to address is that as North Korea went through demographic changes, there is that period that could have a lot of benefits in terms of economic development because you have actively working population here, whether it is South Korea and Hong Kong. When we had the demographic change, we had a very high economic growth. But I don't think that's necessarily the case for North Korea, and I did an analysis on that. So between the income level and the population, I think there was a lot of debate as to whether the population shift would have any effect in terms of economic growth. And in the 1980s, people say that there wasn't any direct correlations between the two. But afterwards, it's not really the population increase, but the population structure change would have an impact on economic growth. With the rapid economic development in East Asia, there was a lot of discussions on that. Hence, the notion of a population dividend. We say the second dividend. We're looking at the first dividend for the population. So population shift. When we had the population shift, you would have the people in the 15 years of age and 64 who are actively working population, which would facilitate the economic growth of a country. Then we could say that there's that dividend effect coming from population change. If you look at other experiments, it shows that maybe 1/3 of economic growth is explained by this factor. Now we will have Africa growing, Africa emerging, and 15 to 20% of that growth will come from the population dividend effect. So population structural change, demographic changes have an effect on economic growth. So if you have a good population shift, does it necessarily mean that you would have an automatic economic growth? I don't think that's the case because it just provides that window of opportunity for the country to grow. But it has to be accompanied by policy choices which could really bring that actual benefits of the dividends. For example, you would have to have a flexible labor market. You need to have investment. Can you finish in 2 minutes? So as for the population dividend, we did some estimation here. This is a method that I use, but I'm not going to talk about this today. So let's just look at the results of that estimation. Now we have these countries grouping by income, and we have these countries grouping by region. Now the red line that stands out, that's for North Korea. So the higher it is, it says that the more dividend that you would have from population. And from 75 to early 90s, there were a lot of population dividends in North Korea. And especially if you look at it by region, there's a lot of dividend concentrated among, for example, countries in East Asia, which is marked in green. Even North Korea's line is higher than that of East Asian countries, where there was a lot of dividend. So from 75 to 95, North Korea actually was in a very good position to grow its economy in terms of population. Nevertheless, North Korea failed at growing its economy, even with all these population dividends. Slides below show North Korea. Here, the NK. That's a North Korean line. The x-axis shows that the population growth rate was very high. Out of 47 countries, it was the 18th largest, but in terms of income growth rate, across the distribution, it is sitting at the bottom quartile. So the income growth was not as high as the growth rate of population. Then why so? How can we explain this? Why did North Korea fail at utilizing the population dividends? That requires further research. Hence, I just decided not to include that in my presentation. Perhaps it's due to policy failures or lack of incentives that are such a big problem in a socialist country. That's where I want to focus my future research on. Thank you very much. So demographic changes or demographic growth, and how does that really relate to economic growth for the country? I need to do a very effective time management for the session. So I think I would ask my speakers to perhaps talk less than 20 minutes. By 1 or 2 minutes, I'm going to invite Dr. Choi Ji-young from KINU. She'll be talking about the demographic growth at the same time. What I want to understand is this.
겠지만
So I know the discussants will also ask some questions, but as Dr. Hong said in the later part of his presentation, the DPRK demographics might be a little bit more favorable for its economy going forward. So this is a positive, I think. So can you, I would hope that the discussants can maybe point to that, his discussion, in their discussion. So now we would like to hear from Dr. Choi Ji-young, who's going to talk about the employment structure of North Korea, the trends, and its implication. We'll give you about 19 minutes. Hello, my name is Choi Ji-young. Today I'm going to talk about the employment structure of North Korea, the trends, and its implication. I would like to begin by telling you about the motivation behind my research. When we study the DPRK economy, there is an absolute lack of data and materials. However, in 1993 and on, the UN provided some support to North Korea to do a population census. And so a lot of research was conducted based on the population census that North Korea was able to do. In the census, there is some information regarding the employment, broken down into industries, into occupations, and also when there is a transition in the regime, when we think about InterKorean economic cooperation, for example, DPRK labor is a very important issue. DPRK is a low-income country, but despite that, in 2004, it's already seen aging. In fact, the aged population took up 7% of its population, which means that the DPRK is already an aging society. This is not very good. It does not bode well for its employment, but we also see it's even worse in South Korea. Fertility rates and population aging is actually worse in South Korea, so it's comparatively better in the DPRK. As you know, population is very important because they provide labor resources for the economy. So perhaps going forward, when DPRK can have a sort of very accelerated growth in terms of its economy, I wanted to see what will the population and what will its employment structure look like in the future. In 1993, the 2008 population census, and in 2014, there was a population survey that was conducted by North Korea. It's not necessarily a census, but it's a survey on the social and welfare condition of the North Korean residents, and this is a sample data. So I'm going to pull information from these 3 pieces of data to try to use to understand the recent trends in the employment structure of North Korea and the population demographics of North Korea. So with this, I want to pull about 2 implications. Going forward, I want to see what will be the economic growth and the growth of productivity of North Korea during its regime transition. And also, I want to try to see what significance its employment structure will have in the future. I'm going to try to look at 3 things in particular.
전반적으로 좀
First of all, I want to do an overview of labor and employment in North Korea, and based on the data, I want to talk about labor productivity and compare the labor productivity between the two Koreas. Based on that, I want to find some implications for resuming and expanding inter-Korean economic cooperation. Thirdly, I want to look at the sources for economic growth and do an international comparison. Now, we can see the source of economic growth as a demographic effect, or labor utilization effect, or a productivity effect. After the 1990s, I want to see how these different effects contributed to economic development in North Korea. And we will compare North Korea against China and Vietnam, which are also regimes that underwent a transition. So first of all, going to the overview of the labor situation in DPRK. First of all, the labor supply conditions are, if we look at the population of DPRK, we wanted to see the share of working age population. What is the labor supply like? And we compared DPRK with the ROK. The share of working age population, by that I mean people between the years of 15 and 64. On the bottom, you would see North Korea's share and South Korea's share. South Korea has double the total population of DPRK. We both have reached the peak. South Korea reached the peak in 2016. DPRK also reached the peak will reach the peak in about 2022. Its peak of a share of working age population will reach the peak in about 2022, and then it will fall down from there because, as I mentioned before, it already has entered into an aging society. And also, if we take a look at the entire Korean peninsula, in the entire Korean peninsula, the share of working age population will be higher in North Korea. The fertility rate in DPRK is much higher than in South Korea. It's about at 1.9%, so it's much higher. Again, this means that the share of working age population will be steadily increased coming from DPRK than South Korea. So this has some implications about the labor supply going forward. And also, on the right-hand side, you would see those people who are over the age of 15, you would see that the percentage continues to increase. But 15 to 64, you would see that it is going down. The working age population is going down, whereas total population aging is going up. And this is similar for both North and South Korea. Next, I wanted to see how much of the working age population actually participates in the labor force. The three dots on the top are North Korea. The labor census and the labor survey of 2014. So as I mentioned, there are three pieces of data that I pulled from. On the bottom dots, those are the South Korea labor force participation rate. But North Korea's labor participation rate is much higher, but they are on the decline, as you can see, ever since 1990s. So I wanted to see why this phenomenon occurred in the first place. There could be many different factors to explain this. So first up, the labor supply here in this census data, maybe there are only official answers given. So only answers of people working in the official labor supply. So they were not able to capture the unofficial labor supply. For those areas where DPRK is higher than South Korea, because socialist country labor participation rate tends to be comparatively higher than capitalist countries. If we break it down by gender, on the left-hand chart, you would see DPRK. On the right is South Korea. Earlier, I talked about economic participation rates, how the DPRK is slightly higher. Because this is a socialist country, as I mentioned before, their labor participation rate is much higher because socialist country, they want to go for full employment with no unemployment. This is why typically their labor participation rate is higher, and also it is typically higher for women. On the left-hand side, for women in the 35 to 39 years, you see the slight dip in the dotted line. That's women. But if we compare with South Korean women, there we see that big gap, big decline from the age of about 30 to about 40. So it's a M-shaped curve, as you can see, with that dotted line on the right-hand side for women in South Korea. Again, even with labor supply, although compared to South Korea, North Korean women tend to be more employed than in South Korea. So earlier I told you about a general overview of the labor supply. I wanted to break it down further into more detailed employment structure. This is the occupational composition of employments in North Korea. This is only found in the 1993 and 2008 population census. The 2008 and 1993 classifications are a little bit different. In 1993, 23.5% answered that they are farmers, and 63.1% said that I am a manual worker. However, in 2008, you would see that some people, about 29.8%, responded that they are agricultural workers. So you would see that there is a slight increase from farmers to agricultural workers, from 23.5% to 29.8%. There could be many factors to explain this. It could be a statistical classification issue. Because in 1993, those people who said that they are farmers typically are members of agricultural cooperatives, for example. In 2008, the agricultural workers would be those non-members as well. They're all grouped into that category. And another thing is that in 1993 to 2008, one of the big changes in North Korean society was that famine and the Great Hunger. And this means that many people, because of the famine, there was a labor shift from industry to the agricultural sector. Another factor is that there's a higher natural growth of population in the rural regions. And so, because of these three factors, that could explain the change in the occupational composition. Next, looking at the industrial composition of employments in North Korea. Again, we look at 1993 and 2008 population census, but we can also refer to the 2014 survey. You can see that primary industry workers grew from 30.7% to 36%. Secondary industry dipped from 43.9% to 37.5%, and a slight increase in tertiary industry. As I mentioned before, this is very similar to what we saw before with the occupational breakdown, because there was a rise in those workers in the primary industry, but there's a decrease in the secondary industry. This means because of the famine, many people shifted from the industry to the agricultural sector. So because of the labor shift, that could explain this increase and decrease. And also, if we compare 2008 and 2014, you would see that the trend's accelerating. Because in the 2014 survey, you see the primary industry workers increased to 41.8%. However, I should stipulate that the 2014 census, we should not take it in full. It's not 100% to be trusted because the survey is a sample survey and the questions are a little bit different. The question here for the 2014 survey was asking, did you work for the past 6 months? That was a question in 2008. But in 2014, because it was a sample survey, in 2014 they asked, did you work in the past week? So the difference is in 2008, they asked if you worked at any time during the past 6 months, whereas in 2014, they asked, did you work at any time during the past week? So there is that bit of a difference in the way that the questions are structured in the survey and the population census. So this was a general overview of the employment structure in North Korea. So we can take this to look at labor productivity in North Korea. Labor productivity, we can take it as a single factor productivity. So we would define as output per labor input, assuming the human properties such as gender, age, academic background, and skills as being all homogeneous. And in general, we use labor as input. So for example, for every one worker, how much value added came out as output. So we would try to look at that to try to compare North Korea and South Korea. So in 2014 survey, we wanted to take a look at the number of workers there. In 2014, because it's only divided into primary, secondary, and tertiary industries, we also wanted to complement that with the information from the 2008 census to look at all of the number of workers in each industry, and we applied FTE, or the full-time equivalent of South Korea, for the year of 1975. As output, we looked at the GDP estimate by industry released by the Bank of Korea. So we took all these pieces of data to do a comparison. This chart shows the conversion of the number of workers in the 2014 survey by applying the full-time equivalent of South Korea for the year of 1975. So that would be about 11 million. The FTE here, or full-time equivalent, means that for the industrial sector, it's for industry, light industry and heavy industry, it's about 0.97. for them, it's close to 0.97 is very close to 1 because they work 9 to 6. But for other sectors, maybe for agriculture, the farmers, they don't work a full day year round. Maybe they take some seasons off. So in that case, it's a little bit lower at 0.85. So we took a look at this and applied FTE for both for North Korea. And we came up with this data to try to see how much of a value-added output is generated by each individual worker. So what we can see from this is that per worker output as of 2014 is about 3 million Korean won, which is just 5% that of South Korea. If we break it down further into a monthly basis, that's about 250,000 won per month. I understand that in the Kaesong Industrial Complex, as of 2015, the monthly wages is about $165 for North Korean average worker. The Bank of Korea estimates really factor in South Korean numbers, so the levels tend to be a little bit higher. They skew a little bit higher. I should mention that. So I think there is that difference because those estimates are South Korean, but we can still say that 250,000 won is the monthly estimates of the value-added output by a worker. If we break this down into industry, we'd see that for example, industry, it's only about 2.8% of South Korea, but for construction, it's only about 23.3%. It's almost a 23.3% of South Korea. So there is a big discrepancy between some of these numbers. But this is also not likely to be trusted because some North Korean residents say that, yes, I am working in the construction industry, but some people who do work in the construction industry do not answer that they do so. So, for example, there are soldiers or members of the military who do work in construction, who nevertheless responded that they did not work in construction. So in that case, there is more of a labor input than what was reflected in the numbers, and they actually added to the productivity and to the value added. And this is why there are some of these percentages that are very difficult to explain. What we can identify here is that there is a very big gap in labor productivity between North Korea and South Korea, and especially in manufacturing or the industry. Very low labor productivity in North Korea in that particular sector, probably because of the low operation rates of the plants and factories. Lastly, I wanted to look at the source of economic growth and try to do a comparison between DPRK and China and Vietnam. So if we take a look at the 2003 OECD source of economic growth data, the growth of GDP here takes into account the demographic effect, the effect of labor utilization, and the effect of labor productivity. These three factors come into play. So the growth of GDP, per capita GDP, would basically take the working age population in the total labor force of the society and see how much of them are actually utilized, which leads to labor productivity. So looking at the labor productivity, these are the effects that could lead to labor output. So basically it breaks down to how many people are there, how many people are employed, and how many of them are actually productive. I wanted to try to explain the economic growth of DPRK using these three effects or these three factors and compare that with China and Vietnam. First of all, the demographic effect. The line in the middle is DPRK. Working age population, so people aged over 15 and up. There's a big demographic effect in China, followed by in Vietnam, followed by China, and followed that by DPRK. So DPRK is comparatively less impacted by demographic effect. As Dr. Hong has said, the demographic changes occurred very early on in North Korea from the 70s and 90s. So in the 90s, much of the demographic effect disappears. That's probably why we're seeing this outcome. The second effect is labor utilization effect. which is employment and working age population. For China, they fell. And for Vietnam, they were pretty gradual. For DPRK, there are two pieces of data. The ILO data is what you see on the top, and on the bottom, you would see the UN census data. We took that and did an extrapolation. I don't think that the ILO data is very credible because the sources are not properly cited. So we took a look at the UN data and tried to extrapolate the time series. And lastly, it's the labor productivity effect, which is output per worker or GDP per worker. We did a constant of 2011. So GDP constant 2011 international dollars in PPP. As you can see, that's DPRK way on the bottom, that dotted line. They are pretty much stagnant, not much changes in a GDP per worker for about the last 20 years or so. But as you can see, China's productivity really steeply inclined. As well as Vietnam. So we took this to try to understand the economic growth. In the case of China, for 1992 to 2019, they saw 8.43% increase in GDP per capita, and labor productivity is 8.54. So much of their GDP growth came from labor productivity in the case of China. And the working age population ratio is 0.48%, so which was a plus factor for China's GDP growth. But the bulk of the GDP contribution came from labor productivity. But China, the participation rates in economic activity actually fell. It's a negative growth. However, there was a little bit of an unemployment. However, their productivity was so much enhanced that the GDP per capita really increased. In the case of Vietnam, saw a lot of GDP per capita growth coming from the demographic factor. It grew by GDP by about 5.38%. A lot of the productivity came from, a lot of this GDP growth came from labor productivity, but also from working age population ratio. North Korea, they saw GDP per capita decrease by about 1.28%. Its labor productivity fell even more by 1.41%. Its participation rates in economic activity also fell by 0.18%. However, its demographic effect was a plus in surplus category with 0.31. So it had very minimal demographic effect. However, despite that, the GDP per capita fell. If they did not have this plus working age population ratio, then its labor productivity would have gone even down, and its economic activity would have also gone even down, which would lead to a further decline in GDP per capita. So going forward, this would not bode very well for North Korea. I think you are almost out of time, so I would like to end here. So if we consider regime transition of North Korea, because there's weakening demographic effect, there's need to improve labor utilization and productivity for its economic growth. And also, there needs to be restructuring of its industry, particularly its manufacturing sector. And there needs to be more transition from the agricultural industry to the industry side. And also to enhance labor productivity effect. Recently, with Kim Jong Un coming to power, he has been stressing the importance of the knowledge-based economy. So that could be a way for North Korean economy to try to engage in more economic growth. But they would have to open the door to the world to allow influx of foreign capital and technology, leading to spillover effects. Otherwise, it will have very minimal effect. An application for InterKorean economic cooperation, as I mentioned before, South Korea's labor productivity is about 20 times higher than that of North Korea. There is a very big gap between the two, so we can still make use of labor-intensive industry, which would have advantage in the InterKorean economic cooperation. And then, with the low labor productivity in the manufacturing sector, because as I mentioned before, there's very low productivity in that sector in particular, perhaps we can focus on that area for economic cooperation to contribute to the DPRK economy.
Thank you very much. I think we are going beyond our time constraints, so that means we would have less time for discussion. I worry, but thank you anyway for wonderful presentations. Also, to save time, we're going to begin our discussion right away. Hyung Lee from Daegu University. You will talk about women's experiences in restructuring of the family in the Kim Jong Un era. So if you could limit your presentation to maybe 18 to 19 minutes, we would appreciate that very much. Our two previous speakers have talked about how North Korea has gone through demographic changes and how that has anything to do with the economic growth of the country, also based on the population census that was conducted recently. Now, I would like to take a different angle to this, especially in the Kim Jong Un era. How are women experiencing it in their society, and how is the family structure changing in the PRK, and what's the current reality of North Korea? From a researcher's point of view, there were, for example, a lot of research studies on, for example, women in North Korea, what's their social status and what's their role, what are their jobs and occupation. Yes, true that there have been research to that end. But in terms of the status of women in the DPRK society, from a gender-sensitive point of view, I don't think there were a lot of research in that regard. So in 2019, with KINU, researcher Cho and Dr. Lee, we had this joint study back in 2019. We wanted to take a look at the gender politics of North Korea, looking at the women from that lens, especially at a time when gender politics is expanding and it is also undergoing a lot of changes in North Korea. So what are the realistic experiences that women are going through in DPRK? When we try to do a research on experience of people in North Korea, there's a limit in terms of data availability. So in order to look at how things are in North Korea, we have to look at, for example, Rodong Shinmun or Choson Nyosong, which is a Korean women literature, or Choson literature, which would provide any analysis on discourse of policies in North Korea. So we use that as a data. And then on the other side, we looked at North Korean defectors. These migrant women who came from North Korea into South Korea over the last 2 to 3 years. So we conducted an analysis on their oral history, especially women in their 20s and 30s, very young women, as well as women from older generations in their 40s and 50s. We try to compare the experience of the two and how their experience are actually changing depending on their generation. So in the Kim Jong Un era, we see the emergence of gender politics. So it is based on social gender, how power is being redistributed across. So what rights are given to women, what rights are given to men. That's what gender politics is all about. So in 2010, this is when Kim Jong-il was still in power. There was a law on the protection of the rights of women, which was legislated back then. That's recognizing women's various rights, and this is a very important law because that redefined the rights of women. So after the 1995, there was arduous march, and the North Korean economy went through much difficulty, and the North Korean regime afterwards decided to redefine the role and the rights of women and through legislation. So that was in 2010. That actually reflects the changes that occurred in North Korea for the previous 15 to 20 years. This is a law that will recognize women's property rights, inheritance rights, and also there's a provision that would prohibit domestic violence against women. Even if the rights of women are fully insured, there is only a guardianship that is given only to male, and there's also a de facto ban on divorce and official encouragement of childbirth. That is actually strengthening motherhood of women, and child rearing, family support, and social mobilization. All of these elements have become legitimized as a result of the law. Especially in the current Kim Jong Un era in 2012, the Mother's Day was legislated. What is the meaning of this? Because during the arduous march in order to support the family and the state. There was a lot of labor put in by women, and I think the woman's role has been recognized by the state in a way. So it is actually giving the due recognition to women to actually encourage them to do more. And after the 1995, for the past 20 years or so, if we were to look at any significant changes in North Korea, I think the most critical element that we could cite is the introduction of market economy. So over the last 20 years, for example, going back to the arduous march, women were becoming very self-sufficient. They would, for example, trade herb and some medicine in the black market called 장마당 market, but it became legitimized and it is now becoming a platform for the market economy. Of course, there was a lot of chaos, ups and downs and fluctuations. So first, the market started off as a black market, and it became a general market, and then became a general commercial market that led to competition, capitalism. So the definition of market really shows that it is a very important platform that would drive any changes within the North Korean society, and I don't think there's any dispute to that. So there's a formation of material-centered value and individual perspective. And also, there are a lot of cultures coming from outside, which will lead to explosion of change in North Korea. Also, a very important thing to note is that within this new economic sphere, women were at the forefront of the market. Women were the main drivers here, the main agency. So women becoming the main actors of the market economy for the last 20 years, that is what I want to focus on for my presentation. So as North Korea was undergoing this change, the rationing system based on socialist state became weakened. So the family units became the very basic unit for ensuring survival. So prior to this, the state was responsible for everything. But the very basic unit of the economy, rationing system, I wouldn't necessarily say that it has completely collapsed. There is still the rationing system, but it is only a small part of the overall infrastructure. It is that families are left to work on their own to ensure their own survival by taking part in market activities. So the families actually become the very basic unit of economic activities. So through arduous March period, for each family to survive, each family would have to come together as one. They would have to pull their resources together. So what did women exactly do during that period? In the market, women played various roles there. The commercial trading activities are not recognized by the state. They're not officially recognized, and they're undervalued in the country. So officially, even if, for example, men are not given the rations, and even if they're not getting much from the country, they're still given a job at a workplace. But women, most of them who are not at the workplace, would have to make living for the family, would have to ensure the livelihood of the family members, and then they would be more engaged in market activities and becoming main players in the market activities. So after graduating from middle schools, most of women would have to start supporting their family, and they would have to get ready for their own marriage. And after they get married, they would be registered as dependents of their husbands. But they would then be involved in these commercial activities to ensure the survival of the families. So I marked that in blue. For example, women get married, they would just be able to register themselves as the dependents of the husbands. But it was actually the women who had to support the family. So in terms of the high-ranking families and military families, majority of women had to be out there to make a living for their family and their households. Going to these big cities such as Pyongyang, Haesang in the Hamgyong-Buk-do region, We wanted to reach out to them and conduct interviews with these women over there, even if the women from high-ranking families. In Pyongyang, as you can see from the case 14 over here, this is a housewife from Pyongyang. Her sister-in-law actually used a lot of massive capital and then had a big transportation business operating a fleet of buses. Very economically active person, and most of the ordinary women would be involved in the market trading, and they would, for example, be involved in self-sufficient food trading. They would be trading agriculture products, or they would be engaged in intermediary distribution of various herbs and goods. So case 6 is about a woman who was born in the 1980s. Mother is a college English teacher, father being a doctor, still had a difficulty in maintaining the living, so the person had to go to the market to, for example, sell her medicine as well as food. And in 2007, this person got married. Here it says social guarantee for husband. But because the husband was an injured veteran, husband was not capable of making a living for the family. So women had to be out there in the market, sitting on the street to sell products. But because this woman's father was a doctor, she brought these patients to her own home, and she would be injecting IV medications, and then was able to make money from these trading activities. So according to the interviews over here, most of the 장마당 doesn't have any men there, because trading, selling in a daily life of any North Korean is an unofficial activity. Mostly male adults are prohibited from taking any part in the 장마당, the gray market. So the majority of people that you would see in 장마당 are women. Here it says single women traders are the new generation. So this person was born in the mid-1990s. She's in her mid-20s. Her father used to be a trader, but he failed. But utilizing the network that was built by her father, so she began trading herself. She had a shop, so she was able to make a lot of money. And then she hired 2 men in their 20s and 30s, a security guard and money collector. Here the interview excerpts are shown here. It's better to have a husband as an officer instead of trying to study myself. I'm going to college and becoming an officer myself. It says better to nurture a boyfriend to become an officer instead of my trying to have a marriage to an officer. Once you get married, there should be a person doing the housework or making food. I thought about making my mother-in-law behave well or taming my mother-in-law before getting married. So it shows from the point of a survival strategy, a lot of women would have to make effort to support their husbands so they can become successful. So the capital, the money that the woman is making from 장마당, they would, for example, use it as a capital to support their husband, for example, advance into higher positions in law or law enforcement. 장마당 is a legitimate market, but most of the activities in the market are not protected fully by the state. So any illegal activities, for example, bribery, threats, fraud, violence, it would be difficult for women to protect themselves. So they think that they need to have that power, and that protection can come from their husbands. So as a windshield to women's market activities, they want their male counterparts to have that social position or status. That's the type of family strategy that the North Korean women would take. Another point of concern is that the sense of identity is changing amongst us, the North Korean women. Here is case 8, interview transcript. Let me just read it for you. As women are becoming more socially active, we tend to have a bigger voice, and it's better than in the past. It's quite different from my mother's generation when women were just blindly obedient. Now women are the ones who really have a final say. A lot of women are saying this. And number 4 here, through these economic activities, women are now able to make money, and then they have these strengthened positions in society. And in the family, they compete with their spouse to gain control and leadership. This is our view. This is our interpretation, the situation. Because women are now more economically active, economically well off, they can now pursue different dreams and different possibilities, and they have more freedom to pursue their dreams. Most of the women that would flee North Korea to come to South Korea, they're saying this. But before we begin the interview, we always say, we asked them, what was your job in North Korea? They said, well, I was a dependent of my husband. I didn't have any job, that I was unemployed. So we see this sense of insecurity amongst North Korean women. Now, next is the social recognition given by the state according to the law on the protection of women's rights and also the legislation of the Mother's Day. And men have to become more caring towards their women, their wives. Still, even if the framework is saying that there's a prohibition on divorce, there's an encouragement of childbirth, there's still a lot of focus on fertility as well as motherhood of women. Many interviews show that across the board, as the society went through arduous march, there was a weakening of the grand socialist family. There was a restructuring of the family structure. Now, there are different forms of marriage. For example, if you look at upper classes in Pyongyang and other big cities, maybe 20% of top classes are mostly going through arranged marriage, but a lot are just marrying for love. And women don't marry off early in life. They want to marry perhaps in their 30s or so. And for the commoners, the ordinary citizens, they have a de facto marriage. There's a conflict with that de facto common law marriage. Most of the time, men would prefer to have partners who have economic power, who have been, for example, engaged in economic activities in the market. And male, they have to have, for example, a potential to make money, maybe perhaps based on their military positions or official positions. So these are the male partners that women would prefer to have. So they want their partners to be financially capable. There's also relaxation of marriage institution. Many young women don't want to get married because once you're married, it would be almost impossible for women to divorce their partners. So once you're in that institution, you would have to support the whole family, and at the same time, there would be various conflicts coming from the patriarchal system. A lot of control on their activities. So as you can see from the interviews over here, young women are trying to just not marry, stay unmarried, stay single. 1 minute left, please. Nevertheless, because there's a weakening control of the state patriarchy, even if a child is born, the child is not registered right away into the system, but once the child reaches the age of school age, then women would go to the government and register their marriage. And there's also intermarriages, for example, across different backgrounds. For example, a woman from a lower ranking family, once they get a lot of money, will want to marry a man from a better family. So this is my summary. For the last 20 years or so, North Korea has seen the introduction of the market economy, which was quite new to the society. And what's really interesting over here is that this system called market economy, now men are involved in official labor. Official labor means activities at the workplace, for example, in the military or government officials. So women would be given this official labor position, but women would be involved in an unofficial labor in the market. So there's that dual labor structure. which is almost very fully entrenched in the North Korean society based on gender. Second is that as families have gone through a lot of difficulties, families are now becoming the basic unit of economic development that is really related to the rationing system of the state. And women are now imposed with this responsibility for supporting their family. And they're now providing the foundation for maintaining the new dual labor structure. Next point is that there were lots of economic hardships in the DPRK for the last 20 years or so, and by being engaged in 장마당, this black market economy, there were unintended changes and transition in DPRK. And ironically speaking, it is based on gender system. Thank you very much, and I would like to end my presentation here. The changes in North Korea have been very massive, transformative, and people that are in the market, for example, I think about 1 million to 1.1 million people are now involved in any trading activities in the market. We call them small enterprises or micro enterprises, and most of them are women. They're emerging as a new class in North Korea, and which would mean that a lot of significant changes are in order.
We've heard 3 presentations thus far. We do have designated discussants, but you don't have to limit your remarks to one presenter. You can speak to anyone.
소개받은
Good afternoon. I'm Kim Gyu-chul from Korea Development Institute. I will give comments on Dr. Hong's presentation, and then I will just talk briefly about Dr. Choi's presentation. For Dr. Hong's presentation, from an economic history point of view, he looked at the changes in the economic structure as well as the demographic changes. You would have to look at different elements such as politics, economy, and everything else. It is very important to look at these elements, and I think it is very relevant that the research was conducted. In terms of raising the issue, you looked at the early low mortality rate and low birth rate, which was really related to those countries in the middle income level. But in the 1970s, the rates were very low, even compared to the countries in that mid-level income bracket. And you actually call this as a very interesting puzzle to solve. Even if countries were broken down by income, because if you perhaps you want to compare that to countries that went through socialist regime, because in DPRK before 1990s was very similar to that of socialist regimes, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990s, it shows the characteristics that would be very present in the low-income countries. So in terms of early birth rate and the mortality rate, I think they will follow the footstep of the socialist countries. North Korea was not a low-income country, but after the 1970s, whereas other countries grew, its economy actually was in a stalemate, and it actually showed reverse economic growth. So it's now classified as a low-income country. So prior to the 1990s, rather than comparing North Korea to low-income countries, I think you would want to compare that to centrally planned economies or socialist countries. In terms of total fertility rate and the mortality rate and the scatter plot for the income, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, China, these Asian countries are all concentrated in that scatter plots. Other than the economic factors and regime elements, they all belong to the Asian country, and they all come from the Confucianist cultural backgrounds. I think it would have a very strong correlations with the fertility rate. So by income, by economic structure, yes, I think you should also do that by geography as well for the breakdown of the countries. And for the puzzle of the demographic as well as the income, whether it is really coming from the income issue or whether it is coming from the structural issue or whether it is because of the fact that these countries belong to the Asian grouping. So to sum it up, when you compare that to North Korea, I think you need to reset the comparison groups. You could enrich your discussion And when you're analyzing the birth rate as well as the mortality rate, I think there are other factors at play. As for the death rate, that is very much related to the current status. For example, current economic status and the healthcare policies of the state, as well as the modern medical technologies that would be used. But in terms of the fertility rate, not only these elements, I think the future prospect of the social economic changes are also important. Whether we really want to have a child or not, what's really out there is important, but then they want to see what will happen in the future. They want to make sure that their children are given a better future. So such prospect is very important in determining the fertility. So across the economy and society, is it perhaps because of the negative outlook out there for the North Korean economy as a whole? Last question. You said that the death rate really had an impact on fertility rate. So a drop in mortality rate, how did it really translate into the reduction in birth rate? Can you explain to us about the pathway? And the second is related to Che's presentation.
이 북한
Oh, I think that researching labor supply for DPRK can have a lot of implications for InterKorean economic cooperation. I had a lot of expectations for your upcoming research. Labor participation rates in the DPRK, as you mentioned, if I were to comment on that, is much higher in the DPRK compared to South Korea. But when we define labor participation rate, I don't know if we can apply the same definition the way that we have in the market economy to the DPRK economy, because as you mentioned before, in the socialist economy, labor participation rate tends to be very high. And I don't know if we can equate that with the labor participation rate like the kind that we have at the market economy. KDI's Lee Suk said that the official statistics and the actual figures in North Korea are very different. There's a very big gap between the two, so I wonder what are your thoughts on that? And if the labor participation rate is actually true to the reality, then if a North Korean regime will transition into a market economy regime, then perhaps we should worry about unemployment going to happen in DPRK. When we talk about labor productivity, it's really tied in with wages and people's income. You did mention labor productivity, that it's only about 5% of South Korean labor productivity. So if we have some policy implications for that, that means the wages of North Korea should be, for the average North Korean worker, about 1/20th that of South Korean workers. But I wonder if that is really the appropriate level of wages, because in 2018, the Kaesong Industrial Complex, before it closed, as you mentioned, if the people there were paid about $150 to $165, then if we were to compare that with the light industry workers in South Korea, it's actually about $3,200. So is it really an appropriate level of wages for DPRK? So what is the best formula to try to understand the best appropriate wage level for DPRK employees? And maybe if we can have some statistics, then maybe that can be very important data to use to determine the wages of North Korean workers. Thank you very much.
또 최재형 박사
Thank you very much. I think that was a list of questions for our two speakers over here. I think we can maybe summarize the responses for those questions. And Dr. Kim Soo-jung from the Korean Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade.
Hello, my name is Kim Soo-jung. I'm from KIET. Today, we're here to discuss North Korea's socio-economic changes in the context of population, employment, and women. So it was very good for me to hear about all of these different multifaceted perspectives. This was a very good opportunity for me personally. I think we largely talked about employment and women. So I just want to talk more comprehensively about population and employment and women. So first of all, with what Dr. Hong has said, I think that what was really interesting is that the relationship between population and economic growth. I think I'm also very much interested in what leads to economic growth. So for these countries that had a transition, I want to see what kind of factors led to economic development. And based on my research, what I found to be very interesting is that the population's effect in economic development is different from leading advanced countries and transition countries. And I think my findings were also similar to what you saw because, as I mentioned before, if we break down population aging and the economy, what we really have to take note of is the industrial structure. So in my research, the transition economies, in many cases, the population was a burden on the economy because there's so much population, but there was very weak, vulnerable industrial and economic structure to include all of that people. But once the industries and the economy continues to develop, then this leads to a positive outcome in these transition economies. If we were to apply that to DPRK, right now their industry is very weak. Even with the current population, they cannot have enough labor productivity. There's a lack of output, and this means that there is no enhancement of labor income or any labor productivity. So if we take a look at this from that context, the industrial structure and labor input, I think we can maybe solve the puzzle between the population and the economy. I really benefited from Dr. Choi's research as well because I think that you were able to use objective data to try to tie in employment and the economy and the DPRK. For the institutions concerning employment and labor in the DPRK, I think for least developed countries and low-income countries, compared to those countries, the DPRK situation is actually relatively better. As a transition economy, DPRK is trying to undertake some reforms. So maybe they are about to take off into some economic developments, and I think they have comparatively good economic conditions. However, for many socialist economies, they typically show this pattern before they have that economic development. But the awareness and consciousness on labor tends to be very high in the DPRK. This means that if the people are given ample opportunity to work, and if they believe that they can generate output, then they will participate more actively as part of the workforce. So I think that this will lead to enhanced labor productivity. So I think the most important challenge is that in solving the labor productivity issue of DPRK, we would really have to focus on that because although the demographics looks to be a little bit bleak, the more serious problem is that the industrial structure for the DPRK is very weak. It's not leading to enough labor input and it's not leading to a lot of labor output. So to provide more added value, we need to have the relevant industrial structure in place in the DPRK. And to that end, economic cooperation between the two Koreas or international communities, overseas development assistance, can lead to more advanced industrial structure in the DPRK. So we can maybe think about those cooperation projects to assist the DPRK. But the attitude that we have towards InterKorean economic cooperation is that North Koreans offer cheap supply and South Koreans don't have enough labor. And so we offer capital and technology and DPRK offer cheap labor. That is the perspective that many people have when it comes to inter-Korean economic cooperation. But if we maintain that attitude, then we cannot see a sophistication of the industrial structure of DPRK, and their labor productivity will continue to remain stagnant because there will not be enough value added. This means that for the cooperation projects, whether they be done by South Korea or the international community, they need to really take into consideration the advancement of the labor structure of the DPRK. Dr. Choi's suggestion said that we need to invest in the manufacturing sector of the DPRK. For that investment to lead to actual outcome, the labor structure has to be more effective and more efficient. This means there needs to be more education and training to allow for value-added output. There needs to be more demographic changes. So, for example, maybe allow for more women to enter the workforce, women who are not working to enter the workforce, and maybe enhance the incentive structure for labor to provide more of a positive incentive to people who participate in the labor force. When those preconditions are met, then there can be investment made in the manufacturing sector that will lead to a direct positive outcome. So rather than just blindly talking about investing into manufacturing sector, hopefully we can look at instituting all of these preconditions before doing that. Lastly, I do have a question that I want to ask. Right now, we're seeing all of these sanctions placed on the North Korean regime. If these sanctions remain in place, what do you think is going to be the direction of the employment and industrial structure of the DPRK going forward? I also enjoyed Lee Hyung's presentation.
For example, if you look at the WDI data, the women-related indicators in North Korea are okay, but in terms of content or in the private sector, private area, women's status is not that high. That is an impression that I get. So is it before the sanctions regime in North Korea? Is it after the sanctions regime in terms of the roles and the status of women in the private arena? So I want to understand the timing. So whether the social roles have actually been enhanced after the regimes for the sanctions. Do you think that there could be any substantial improvement in terms of improving the status of women in the private sphere?
질문을 여러 가지를
So thank you for asking those valuable questions. Lastly, we'd like to hear from Professor Ingrid Mite's discussion remarks and then move on to an overall discussion round. Professor Mite, please.
Do you hear me? Yes? Okay. 안녕하세요. I send warm greetings to Seoul, and I'm happy that I can participate in this conference, at least in a digital way. I want to commend the work of Yi Hee-young. I have followed her work for many years. I appreciate her research highly, and her work is very important contribution to a better understanding of the current situation in North Korea. The oral history approach chosen by Yi Hee-young is a research method that is outstandingly suited to provide this understanding. In recent decades, oral history has become established internationally as a methodology, not only in history, but also in the social science generally. By giving a voice to the simple people, this approach makes it possible to grasp informal events and people's day-to-day lives. This is extraordinarily important in understanding a country such as North Korea. Open discussion and the free expression of opinions are not possible in dictatorial regimes. Hence, the people are obliged to restrain their thoughts or to limit their expressions to trusted circles of families or friends. This life world is thus divided between an inside and an outside, between private and public sphere. The fact that deviant ideas are not expressed publicly is thus not an indication that such ideas do not exist. It only indicates that they cannot be expressed publicly. Oral history is therefore enormously important for the study of such societies, since the usefulness of published sources is limited. The public sources express the point of view of a regime, and that point of view is not necessarily identical with that of the people who live in the society. Oral history is able to account to those people's point of view. Furthermore, comparative analysis of a regime's official proclamations and the people's interpretations of them can reveal to a more or less significant discrepancy. Yi Hee-young's presentation illustrates this impressively, for example, by showing the mechanisms of an informal market economy. Her presentation also illustrates that there are more or less significant discrepancies in gender practices between the people's day-to-day lives and the official image of women in North Korea. In an oral history project, such as the one presented here, however, the methodological limitations must also be mentioned. For example, Yi's research is focused to draw exclusively on interviews with North Korean refugees. This group is a very specific one. These are people who have intentionally chosen to leave North Korea. In other words, we may assume that the person in this group have a particularly critical view of North Korea and the conditions there. That is a limitation and at the same time an advantage, since these persons speak very openly about problems of the North Korean system. Furthermore, this sample consists of persons who have experienced not only North Korea, but also the flight from the country and the situation in South Korea. Such new experiences lead to processes of biographical reinterpretation. That is, the new experience and discourse in South Korea change the memories of earlier experiences in North Korea. Yi Hee-young is an established biographical researcher who is familiar with these mechanisms and masters the methods to deal with them. In spite of all her methodological experience, however, the problem is not one that can be resolved completely. The selectiveness and the specific characteristics of the sample must therefore be taken into consideration in assessing the significance of the statements made and their validity in regard to women in North Korea generally. In view of the impossibility of working with an empirical control group, that is, with women currently living in North Korea, I think there is no alternative at present to this approximation. To return now to a second point, the question how the life and the work of women in North Korea can be interpreted. If we want to understand foreign life worlds, interpretations always involve the problem of perspective. We perceive those life worlds from our own perspective. This problem was very pronounced during the German unification. The unification process was characterized by a massive de-evaluation of East German experience and by a Western-dominated public discourse, which failed to perceive and often denigrated the nuances of Eastern experiences. A sustainable problem was the fact that the East German people were judged on the basis of the East German state's official proclamations. The state is totalitarian, ergo the people living in the state must be totalitarian too. That was a costly mistake and one of the causes of the skepticism toward democracy that we see in Eastern Germany today. For this reason, we must be on guard against interpretations based on a culture of dominance in trying to understand the situation of North Korean women. Yi Hee-young is highly sensitized to this problem since she has experienced the German unification process and participated in many scholarly studies of it. These experiences are certainly a significant factor in her very sensitive interpretation of the experience of North Korean women. In her presentation, Yi Hee-young shed light on some very significant generation and class-specific changes in the life situation of North Korean women. She has brought to light the economic function of the family and the role of women in it. She has identified the role of women in North Korea's informal economy. And she has introduced us to realities that diverge to a greater or lesser extent from what we are familiar with. These are very important investigations, but this is still at best the tip of the iceberg in regard to the specific experience of women in North Korea. Many other important research topics are still waiting to be investigated. For example, research about everyday life or about how women experience work or economic in North Korea. We saw a lot of statistics in this session here, but statistics are not all. It is also important to investigate how economic situation is experienced, and I think this is what Yi Hee-young did, and in this way I think the paper we heard in this session complete each other in a very perfect way. We make hope that this research field, the situation of women in North Korea, will continue to be developed and strongly funded in the years to come. If the future should bring a reunification of Korea or even a stronger cooperation between the two Koreas, knowledge of the lived realities will be an essential prerequisite if the people on both sides are to meet as equals and not repeat the mistake of the German unification. 감사합니다.
예, 고맙습니다. 우리 이희영 교수님.
Thank you very much. That was on Dr. Lee's presentation that Ingrid shared her understanding about the presentation. Perhaps there was a bit of an overstretch interpretation issue that was noted by the panelists, especially in terms of interpreting North Korea's literatures and data. There's calls for caution. While I was listening to Dr. Mitte's comments, actually Dr. Lee thought about how women are given the formal labor and women are given the informal labor. That was a typology that drew from the presentation. Perhaps I thought that was maybe a bit too stretched out, but still a lot of good questions were raised. And in the remaining portion of the discussion, especially thanks to our panelists, they saved up a lot of time, so we would be able to have a productive discussion amongst ourselves. Now, I'm going to pass over the microphone to our speakers. Let's not be too much backward looking. You don't have to go back to your papers and try to answer every single one of the questions. I think there are some commonalities that we saw here from the panelists. Now, in DPRK, under the new leadership of Kim Jong Un, I think it's been less than 9 years or 10 years, there was a rapid change in terms of policy architecture. They're proclaiming these new policies and they're implementing them very fast. So in terms of population, after arduous march, we're not exactly sure about the scale. Perhaps more than 1 million people have lost their lives during the process. So they had a massive structural change, I would assume. And afterwards, this economic development, or Dr. Choi said, catch up. Growth, catch-up economy development. So North Korea, in fact, is in that phase of rapid development. So what are the elements needed? What are their concerns? What are their priorities? If you could focus your responses on that topic, we would appreciate that. So going back to the demographic change and how that was related to economic growth and how that could be useful to economic growth, or whether that is going to serve as an impediment to economic growth. So we could address that. And from the industrial structure issue, or on that issue, in terms of the agriculture data, in 2014, the agriculture population actually increased in number. And up until 2013, there was a bit increase in terms of agriculture population. I think that requires caution in interpretation. And how should we interpret this increase in population, agriculture farming population? And for the last 10 years, the country is now focused on economic development. The fourth industrial revolution, the 4.0 industries are the target for the North Korean regime. They want to put a lot of investment. They want to focus on science development, and they want to ensure that there's strong education. There's a massive investment by North Korea into advanced technologies with educational reform. Now, Industry 3.0, for example, media and IT, are they all classified as Industry 3.0? I don't know whether there are any statistics that you can share with us. How should we interpret this? If we could get your views on that, we would then be able to understand the direction of the DPRK's economic development and how that is related to population change in the country and how the industrial structure functions within that framework. Of course, as a result of these actions, the women's role is also very relevant, especially in the process of economic development. There are about or so market across the country. Now, the women over here, they put out their goods on the street and they sell those products. It's about 1.0, 1.2 million people that are involved in the trading activities. There's a lot of micro businesses in North Korea, and they're really contributing significantly to the development of the country. And that's actually leading to gender changes in society. So, in that framework, the questions that we got from the panelists, if we can get responses from our speakers, Dr. Hong, perhaps 5 minutes can be spent by you. If you can address those questions and comments, please, Dr. Hong. So let me just touch upon these questions here. I think this was related to country classification grouping, the socialist countries or countries in the Confucianist cultural region. Yes, I think you made a very valid point that we need to take a look at those countries and break them down by different clusters. In terms of fertility rate and how it is determined, you talked about the future prospect. If you do, for example, I think there are very general discussions in advanced studies. I'm not sure whether future prospect was actually cited as a determining factor for fertility rate. I could probably look up those literatures, whether future prospect was also cited, and how is death rate related to fertility rate. You have, for example, the number of children that you want to have in your life. So there's that target for everyone. So if you have high mortality rate for children and you take that into consideration and you have more children as a result, but once the mortality rate is improved to a certain level, then women feel or parents feel that they don't have to give birth to as many children as before because their children will be able to survive. Hence, they have less fertility. And Dr. Kim talked about the industrial structure, how industrial structure has to be considered in this whole equation, looking at the relations between the income level and demographic changes. How come North Korea was not able to grow its economy even when there's dividend effect? And I will take that into consideration when I look at the causes of this phenomenon. And as was mentioned by the moderator, how population structure is affecting the economic growth of a country. Looking at 2020, you have productive population that is very massive, very large, and I think they're reaching the peak, as was mentioned by Dr. Choi, and they're going to reach that peak and come down afterwards. So productive population is very big. That's very positive. And once it starts to come down, then it is a negative factor. So there's both the positive and negative side to that. And it is going to become more disadvantageous as time passes by. So the population structure is not going to play as a favorable element towards economic development of a country. Thank you.
최 박사님.
So, Dr. Choi. It was really interesting to hear the other presenters and also the other discussants as well. I really enjoyed the questions raised, and I do agree with most of what's been said. I think that this presentation, because we did not look at official statistics because they're not available, the DPRK regime, I just wanted to do a rough sketch using the objective data that we were able to get. And of course, I have to build on this. What Dr. Kim has said with the labor force participation rate, I think if we look at the actual working hours, there will be a very big gap, like you said. Because as I mentioned before, the socialist countries, they tend to have a very high level of labor participation rate because even though there is some unemployment there, if we look at working hour labor productivity, even if they are working, the hours that they put in might be very much lower than what we see in market economy. But earlier, if we compare with China or Vietnam. North Korea had better figures in the 1990s. In the 1990s, China and Vietnam, they were seeing a level of transition, but even so, DPRK's labor participation rate is higher than that. So while the DPRK is a socialist economy, there must be some sort of characteristics that are unique to DPRK. But we cannot just interpret that from our definition of labor force participation. So there is that to consider. I looked at per capita GDP, just a very simple comparison between South Korea and North Korea. There is definitely a problem with the numerator and the denominator because if we look at the BOK data, that's really just focused more on South Korea and it's under-evaluated. So there are definitely a lot of limitations. No, in evaluating labor productivity, that is going to be a very important issue, but it hasn't seen a lot of research. So I hope that because this has a lot of implications to economic cooperation, there can be more research here. But we have to take a more multidimensional approach to this using macroeconomic data to complement the research, for example, maybe with GDP. A reevaluation, and also we haven't done a lot of research on Kaesong Industrial Complex. There was some debate whether the wages of the workers at Kaesong were really appropriate. So I do hope there will be some work there. And there's also some dispatch workers working in DPRK. So we can perhaps use that as well. We have to try to take a multidimensional approach to try to actually see the labor productivity in the DPRK. I also agree with what Kim Soo-jung said. Industrial labor division is very important, and so there needs to be a reform of the labor structure to try to enhance labor productivity in the DPRK. But I think there needs to be two approaches. There's cheap labor in the DPRK and capital and technology of South Korea. I think that framework is also somewhat valuable, and that framework was successful for Kaesong Industry Complex. But there needs to be actual industrial structural upheaval within DPRK society to lead to actual economic cooperation. While preparing my research, I felt that there is lack of capital in DPRK. There are many challenges, but they still use a labor input to try to do massive land infrastructure projects, for example. And this is really what they are using to try to hold up and prop up the economy. But if there can be some more investment in the manufacturing sector, lead to labor productivity and a sort of a labor restructuring, like you said, and not just in a special economic zones, but also around the economy, that would be very helpful. And also the effects of sanctions, I think that what the moderator said is also pertinent here. The 2014 data is a little bit problematic because it's sampling data, but for manufacturing, because there's a limit to how much manufacturing can rise, and there's a labor force depletion in the primary and secondary industry. And this was even more aggravated from 2008 to 2014. I don't know if the numbers really show that. But if the sanctions continue, then I think that this is also going to aggravate the situation because mining and manufacturing are adversely impacted by the sanctions. These workers have nowhere to go. They don't really have anything to do than just go to the industry. So that is a big concern. And also, North Korea is stressing a knowledge-based economy, and I think they understand where they are. They don't have a lot of good demographics, and labor productivity is low, but they're not really seeing a lot of achievements. It's not leading to actual economic growth. There's a very big gap between policy and results.
고맙습니다. 우리 이희영 교수님.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Would you like to respond? Dr. Ingrid Mitte and Dr. Kim and our moderator. I'm just going to briefly mention the points that you've commented. Dr. Mitte pointed out that oral life history methodology And there's a very important factor in relation to the oral history methodology. Like you said, in the previous East German culture and in assessing their activities, the mainstream views of the West German were imposed, which could lead to the problem of interpretation because of values are at play. So the Western values will be imposed on East Germany, and the vitality and the positive aspects of East Germany would be undervalued and under assessed and discounted, and that's actually leading to a lot of issues in the current German society. So I think it is really important to have a good interpretation of the data available. So as Dr. Amite mentioned, those people that I've interviewed for my research were people, the North Korean defectors into South Korea. And we have to understand where they're speaking from and how to actually describe their oral history. What are they trying to say from where they stand, and whether do they really represent the view of the mainstream female population in Korean society? How can we actually trace that back to their experiences? And as an interpreter myself, I think you raise a question about myself as an interpreter. I am coming from South Korea. I'm a woman living in South Korea. And looking at DPRK women's oral experience, their verbal history, was I really sensitive to interpreting their views? When dealing with the data here, I need to fully understand that there could be an issue of interpretation. Only then the data, its vivid experience, can be fully captured in study. The oral history, oral life history, their orientation, or methodologies, they can serve as very critical factors because whenever a person says a certain thing, the person would tend to, for example, exaggerate and emphasize. And even within that spontaneous narrative in the verbal communication process, the narratives themselves would capture the memory and history of the past, and it would really serve. Well, it would actually be beneficial in terms of understanding where that history is coming from, because you could actually read a lot from such spontaneous narratives of people, how they used to live their lives, and the type of experience that these women went through in their lives. So I try to look at it from that point of view. And as you mentioned, we need to understand that I need to understand that I'm a South Korean researcher, and I need to have a correct interpretation of the things that I see with North Korean women. So you said it is an excessive interpretation, but I don't think this is really a matter of excessive interpretation. I think it is a sensitivity to interpretation, as was mentioned by the moderator. And the moderator said how there's a dichotomy between men and women in terms of labor, official labor to men and unofficial labor to women. You raise an issue as to whether that's to an excessive a point, but I really don't agree with you, because in 2015 or so, I have been able to collect this oral history of women in North Korea. And after the arduous March period, at least in the North Korean society, women have been making the ends meet for their families. It is because the state is not giving an official recognition of the woman's role in that economic activities. And by engaging in these market activities, women are working as micro-enterprises, and they're making these economic means. But in conclusion, what I wanted to emphasize is this. In the last 20 or 30 years or so, what really stands out is that there's a gender-based dual labor market structure, and it is just left as is. But as the other speakers mentioned, whatever the industrial structure that North Korea wants to seek, whether the current model is really viable and sustainable, whether this model should go through any changes, that leaves a lot to think about. I think this is also related to the question that was posed by Kim Soo-jung. After the sanctions regime, women really don't have a lot of high status in their private affairs, and I think that's the current case for North Korean women because I talked about the state patriarchy. According through the law in 2010, there was a prohibition against domestic violence for women. The provision is there, which shows that there was a lot of domestic violence against women in daily lives. So women are the ground and men are the skies, the heaven, the skies. Because there's that gender gap between men and women, leading to the lack of social recognition for women. But ironically speaking, in the last 20 years or so, during the arduous March period, women have been very much involved in economic activities. Although they're not fully recognized and acknowledged by the state, that's actually changing the way they view themselves, their sense of identity. Thank you very much.
우리에게 주어진 시간이 이미 다 지났고
I think that it is past the time that we have to end, so we don't really have a lot of time because this is where we talked about some very important issues. Our session was to look back over the past 9 or 10 years of Kim Jong Un's leadership, talk about some very hard issues. We were focused on nuclear weapons and the new leadership style of Kim Jong Un. But we really wanted to see what kind of changes are happening within North Korea in terms of demographics, industrial structure, women, gender, family, and this is what we looked at. As Professor Mite said, we do not have a lot of official statistics. Even if we do have official statistics coming from DPRK, it's hard to see them as credible. For example, with the unemployment rate, it's difficult to tell what the actual numbers are. So in some cases, just after the arduous March, when it was really difficult, unemployment was about 80 or 90%, according to some statistics. Usually it says that it's about 50%, but even that is really unsustainable. So that's the formal numbers or official numbers. But in fact, I think that we can safely assume that there are many unemployed people in the DPRK. I think that we have to find ways to seek breakthroughs and try to come up with the best and appropriate policies to respond and to prepare for these changes within DPRK. But I don't think that we should just look at the demographics or economy, but they're also tied in with the politics, for example, and openness. And so we have to go beyond all that, especially when we're talking about a closed regime that is the DPRK. So that is something that we really have to consider, because many people are used to seeing a very closed regime in the DPRK. I think some of the government officials are finding it a little bit difficult to adjust to these changes that they're seeing in North Korea. And so it's very difficult to formulate policies in that regard, which is why I think that when we talk about InterKorean economic cooperation in particular, that is very important. And so we need to pull the wisdom and insight together for the formulation of these policies. And moreover, to have development in our humanity, there needs to be free discussion and more openness and reform. And that level of communication is very important for us. And so we have to set a policy agenda. We're seeing DPRK make those changes. Hopefully there will be that reform and openness in DPRK as well, so that there will be more cooperation fostered between the two Koreas going forward. Today we talked about the economic transition, regime transition in DPRK, especially focusing on population, employment, and women. I would like to thank the three presenters and the three discussants, especially Professor Ingrid Miete, who has joined us all the way from Germany. Thank you so much for joining us online. And I would also like to thank all of the audience members for joining us online. Thank you.